So I think all the panelists are here. Welcome. And also welcome to all of those who are joining us online and on Facebook. And I think we can all see Bea too, and she's helping to coordinate things, I hope. I'm in Coffs Harbour right now, so I thought I would just start with a welcome to country. I acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land upon which we all are, on which we all meet. I'm in the country of the Gambunga people who've cared for this land since time immemorial. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and commit ourselves to a future with reconciliation and renewal at its heart. So welcome to everybody. Anybody who wants to divert their attention for a moment and look on the radar, you will understand why there is massive thunder booming in the background here at Coffs Harbour, because there's massive thunderstorms around, but we'll do our best.
Yeah, we just lost power here, David, and I didn't think I'd be able to join you, but in fact, I just sent a message to that effect. But anyway, it's back. But we're same storm.
So what I'm going to do is firstly just get each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Then I'll run through maybe 5 minutes of slides because it's a slide night. And then we will start to deal with the questions. Now, we've had literally hundreds of questions, and Bea from Drive Change campaign has been allocating them and condensing them into some that we can deal with. We'll do our best. Use the chat and the Q&A line, and the moderators will feed them through to us if we have time. I'm David Heilpern, and I was a magistrate. I resigned a couple of years ago, mostly because I was sick to death of the drug driving laws, and since then I've been part of the Drive Change campaign. I think it's fair to say that I thought the campaign would go for a couple of weeks and we'd have massive success, and the drug driving laws would change to at least allow those with prescriptions to drive. Oh, wishful thinking. So here we are. And in fact, I was lamenting that to Lucy Haslam, who I know is on this call somewhere, and she just laughed at me because it's going to be a long road. But that's where we're up to, and we're happy to answer questions for you tonight. So that's me. And I'll now, in order that on my screen at least, get people to introduce themselves. Fiona.
Thank you, David. And I'd also like to note that I'm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation down here in Melbourne, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, but any Aboriginal people who are joining us today for this, frustrating topic. And I must say I've spent the last 2 or 3 years putting up bills, talking to government about this, and every time I raise this issue, to introduce myself, I'm a member of Parliament in Victoria, and I'm the leader of the Reason Party, but I've also put up a number of bills to try and fix what I see as just a small oversight in the legislation, that when Victoria bravely legalised medicinal cannabis and took Australia on that route towards recognising the medicinal purposes of cannabis, that we would have just quickly realised the mistake we'd made and fixed our driving laws to enable our medicinal cannabis patients to be treated equally. I've put up amendment after amendment. I put up a bill last year which was then referred to a committee, and that committee was established to consider how we would enable medicinal cannabis patients to drive safely. We had lots of people on that committee. Anyway, the upshot of that was that we couldn't agree. And when I say we couldn't agree, most of us, the police could not agree that this was sensible, that this was not going to cause mass carnage on the roads of Melbourne. But I'm looking forward to talking and answering questions.
Thanks so much, Fiona. Tom, Dr. Tom.
Hi everyone. Yes, my name's Thomas Arkell. I'm a psychopharmacologist. I realise many of you may have absolutely no idea what that means or what I do, but it basically means that I study drugs and their effects on the brain and behavior. So I've always been interested, I suppose, in how molecules can have such dramatic effects on the way we think and act. And cannabis is a particularly interesting drug to study, first of all, because it's a plant with a very long history of use, and second, because it's made up of a whole range of molecules. Are really only just beginning to understand, what these really do. So most of the research that I've been involved in to date has looked at really how different types of cannabis impact driving performance and cognitive function. So that, things like attention, reaction time, processing speed, all these sort of processes that go on in the brain. So I finished my PhD last year with the Lambert Initiative in Sydney. I recently moved down to Melbourne, and I'm now working at Swinburne University. The research I normally do involves generally running randomized controlled trials where we basically aim to better understand how cannabis is exerting its effects, what these effects look like, how long do they last, and things like that. So I recently spent some time in the Netherlands where we ran a study where we looked at cannabis and its effects on real-world driving. So we got people stoned and gave them different types of cannabis. They went out driving in traffic on a highway. And we found a couple of things. First of all, that CBD by itself doesn't actually produce any driving impairment. CBD doesn't reduce the impairing effects of THC, and THC can cause some impairment, but that typically disappears within 4 hours. So that. I suppose these are the sorts of questions I'm interested in. As a scientist, I suppose I see my job being to try and find the truth here and to provide a balanced and a neutral perspective on how cannabis does impact driving, and then hopefully to deliver this in a way that it can guide policy and laws in Australia. Now, unfortunately, that isn't always the case, which is why I'm here today. But that's what I'm trying to do, I suppose.
Thanks very much, Tom. Mick Palmer.
Yes, David. Well, thank you very much. I'm at the other end of the spectrum, I guess, from Dr. Tom. There's nothing very scientific about me or my background, but I'm a whole-of-life police officer, essentially. I had some 33 years service in policing, 25 in the Northern Territory, and then 7 when I was Commissioner of the Australian Federal Police. So my practical experience essentially is in policing. I had a 5-year gap after 15 years of police service, and studied and then practiced law at the private bar in Queensland for a couple of years in the 1980s. The combination of those experiences, I guess, have fashioned my views on what drug policy should be more broadly, and certainly what drug driving policy should be, and what is wrong with what is currently in place, and what is the reality of the environment. And so my views were changed really by personal experience, by the things I noticed first as an operational police officer, and then later as a managing police officer, in terms of what worked and what didn't, and what law enforcement should be engaged in and what it shouldn't be. And then later as a private counsel, where, of course, I found myself defending the people I used to lock up. And again, that gave me a completely different perspective, as David would well understand, in terms of realising there's a lot more value to many of the people that I was defending than I'd ever thought there was when I was locking many of them up. So that in itself was a huge educational curve for me. So a lot of lessons learned through that process, which led me to get engaged. I retired from policing in 2001, did a series of reviews for the Commonwealth and state governments over the next 12 or so years. But since that time, I've worked steadily in the drug reform and the PTSD areas, essentially, I guess, mental health and PTSD, worked strongly with the NOFS Foundation, with the Justice Reform Initiative, with Smart Recovery Australia Rehabilitation group, not-for-profit group, and so on. So really trying to put something back into an environment that I guess I learned from painful experience, and which I think we could do much better in. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Mick, and we're really pleased to have you and Fiona and Tom here, and of course, Dr. Teresa Towpik. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you very much, David. So my name is Dr. Teresa Towpik, and I am the medical director and co-founder of MediHuanna, which is an organization devoted to deliver science-based medicinal cannabis education to doctors and other health professionals. So far, we've trained hundreds of doctors through our Zoom workshops. I also have prescribed medicinal cannabis for many patients and observed quite significant positive therapeutic effects. And quite often I've heard from patients, oh, by the way, my brain is not so foggy anymore. I am feeling more alert. And actually, many of them commented my driving is better as well. So I had this dilemma as a prescribing doctor, what do I do? It's difficult because patients are feeling better and performing better, and at the same time, they could be penalized for driving. I also, I am a medicinal cannabis patient myself. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with recurrent metastatic breast cancer. Original diagnosis 20 years ago. It's going into the third year, and I'm doing very well. I'm using cannabis, combination of THC and CBD in conjunction with conventional treatment. I'm doing very well. Recent scans actually showed complete resolution of changes in my lung. I still have some bony lesions. So I'm a patient as well. And beginning of May, on the way of to Nimbin, I was drug tested. I was tested negative, even though I am taking cannabis regularly, but I stopped it for 2 nights. So I can see the dilemma on both with regards to unfair laws on driving. It is very difficult because as a patient, I am not impaired. I'm quite alert and I am driving, and I know that if stopped, I could be penalized, which is really quite unfair. So I feel for patients. And also during our workshops with doctors, there's quite a lot of discussion happening about these laws on driving, because more and more GPs are willing to prescribe medicinal cannabis. They are embracing this quite well, but at the same time, they feel quite limited by the law. And unfortunately, quite often clinical decisions are based on not patients are needed, on what patients are needing, but whether or not they can drive. And quite often they need a bit of THC, especially in chronic pain management. But most of the time, doctors focus on prescribing just CBD, which is not a very good situation for anyone. So I'm really concerned, and therefore I decided to become involved, become an advocate. And I think the laws have to change.
Thank you very much, Dr. Teresa.
Thank you.
Hopefully you can hear me now. Thanks for that brief introduction. I'm going to run through some slides now. I've been trained in screen sharing, so here we go. I hope everyone can see that, and B's going to send me an SMS if they can't. But that's the introductory slide, and the next one is giving us the context. The context of this is there's about 75,000 active medical cannabis patients in Australia. Now, of course, we're talking about prescribed patients at this stage. If you add the green market, you could add a lot more. And of course, all the other illicit users. But, and of course, we all know about the barriers in terms of cost and the like. About 70% of those have a substance with THC, are taking a substance with THC in it. And I think it's worth remembering right at the start that people are taking cannabis, THC, every day. This is not a once a week type medication. So the current system detects, is about detection, not affectation. We're not talking about people driving under the influence or driving while they're affected or weaving all over the road, though that offence should remain and does remain both for cannabis and all other licit and illicit drugs. But with THC, it is detected at such low levels that it has no correlation between presence and impairment. In New South Wales, the cutoff is for detection is 5 nanograms, which is 5,000 millionths of a gram. In Australia, there are 500,000 tests plus every year. We just had an announcement last week that in New South Wales, there was going to be 250,000 in the calendar year to 2022. So it's growing rapidly throughout Australia. The strike rate for all drugs is 8%. That means 8 out of every 100 people that are tested will test positive. 80% of those are testing positive for THC. So the vast, vast majority are cannabis and not drugs such as the other drugs that are tested, New South Wales cocaine, but all other states as well, methamphetamine. THC in saliva and blood It's detectable in saliva for up to 9 days. Now, of course, that's a little contentious, but that's the only legal finding on that issue, and I made it after hearing several experts. But we might hear from Tom on that a little later. In blood for even longer. And of course, we all know that THC, unlike so many other drugs, is fat soluble, stays in your system, and is able to be detected for longer than, say, ice, speed, or ecstasy. This is the question that if I had $1 for every time I was asked this question, well, I have a prescription, I keep it in my glove box, and if the police pull me over, I'll just show them my prescription. No, it doesn't work. And there are people every day in New South Wales courts, and indeed all over Australia, who come before courts even though they have a prescription. And it's only a detectable offence. Except in Tasmania, where they have a law that says no. If you are on a prescription and you're taking it in accordance with that prescription, then that is a defence to the charge. Of course, that has led, and I'm being sarcastic here, to a catastrophic effect in Tasmania, with thousands upon thousands of people dying as a result of this fantastic and exceptional provision. Of course, we're one of the only countries or places in the world that has this detection system. Canada, UK, EU, and most states in the United States. 37 out of 51 have defences for medicinal cannabis. Politicians will say this is about road safety. I've yet to see a single piece of evidence that shows there is any correlation between medicinal cannabis use and any single collision, any single injury, or any single death. There's not been a single finding from any coronial inquest anywhere in Australia that draws a connection between the two. There's a link there to a blog that I've written about the false statements that come across about road safety. So this is not about road safety. The other correlation that is made all the time, particularly by politicians, not Fiona Patten, is that this offence is all about stopping people driving, weaving all over the road. And we know that that's not, and that is a classic straw man argument. The other thing that we face all the time is this argument that illicit drugs are a major cause of road trauma. Illicit drugs are present in a lot of situations where there is road trauma, but there is no evidence as to causation. And of course, it ignores the dangers of prescription drugs, other illicit drugs. And one of the pieces of research that was done for the committee that Fiona spoke about dispels the myths that illicit drugs are a major cause of road trauma as opposed to prescription drugs. Other people say, well, it's only a traffic offence, you get no criminal record. Without going into the complications of that, basically that's crap. Whether you call it a traffic record, whether you call it a criminal record, whether you call it a court record, it's a record, and it stops you doing an enormous number of things. I have a client who was a glacier and got this, and he just simply can't get insurance. He's out of business, can't get any business for his, insurance for his business. There's some prominent people who've lost their security licenses and their whole business and their livelihoods as a result of a non-conviction for this offence. I think there are Australian developments. There is a bill before Victorian Parliament. Is it still before the Parliament, Fiona, or not?
It is. It is still sitting there, and in fact, yeah, it's there waiting.
Great. And Tammy Franks has one in South Australia as well. She's a Greens upper house member in South Australia, and I addressed parliamentarians in South Australia a few months ago, and the feedback was really positive, but who knows? Who knows where we're going with that? It doesn't affect my insurance. Well, too bad. If you're with Amy and many other policies, it can, and it does. That again keeps a whole lot of people who are prescription cannabis users from utilising that. So at Drive Change, we're trying to change driving laws for reform that is fair and equal and improves public health. That's our aim. That's the team from Drive Change. I'm the oldest, as you can see, by a long way. Gino looks nearly as old as me, but not in that photo. And we have a lot of friends and supporters and ambassadors. I have to say we have been supported by the industry, and why not? I mean, how can you have a medicinal cannabis industry if the people that you are wanting to treat and sell medicinal cannabis to can't drive? It limits your market considerably. And so the industry, those members of the industry you can see there, have been sponsoring and assisting our campaign. So just to sum up, cannabis is the only prescription drug that faces drug detection regimes. Cannabis straddles this weird divide between, on the one hand, illicit drug, and on the other hand, a prescription medicine. And because of that, and because the law hasn't caught up with reality, we're stuck with this discriminatory process. We have a petition running, and please do join us on and register at Drive Change. Join us with the petition and help us to change things. So that is the end of the little mini presentation for everyone. And I think now we will start with some questions. I'm going to throw the first question out to Fiona, and it is this: what is the biggest hurdle in changing these discriminatory laws for legally prescribed patients?
I'm afraid to say it's actually the police force. And this has come up time and time again. And during the working group, when we looked at trying to find a solution, and most of us were there to find a solution, to work with the medical profession, to talk about what sort of advice doctors could provide to their patients about ensuring that they drove safely. The police kept coming forward with a what if hypothetical scenario. What if we stopped someone, they tested positive, and they showed us their medicinal cannabis card or prescription, and then they went off and had an accident and someone died. We couldn't live with ourselves. We can never let that happen. There was also this presumption, and it's an awful, awful presumption and stigma around medicinal cannabis patients, that somehow these patients are really tricking the system, and that they're actually going to have bongs for breakfast, and then pretend that they've got some illness, and pretend that they've got symptoms that qualify them for medicinal cannabis. So sadly, this is where it is, because like you, David, you speak to politicians. I know Mick does. I know Tom does. Teresa does. When you speak to them one-to-one, they all know someone. They all know a patient. They all know someone that medicinal cannabis has helped. But we just hit this barrier. And in my case, in Victoria, I am hopeful that we will have a brave government that just says, no, this is the right thing to do. We can find the safe way to do it. Tom's work, all of the work, and we can get this changed. And I'm hopeful before the end of the year.
Thank you. Mick, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind saying a couple of things, if you wouldn't mind, David. I think, in my experience, Fiona, the police attitude varies from location to location. In my recent, two examples I can give. A couple of years ago, we're working with Lucy Haslam at her first symposium, actually, in Tamworth, when Dan, her son, was still alive. At that time, as you might remember, Mike Baird, the then Premier of New South Wales, actually met with young Dan, saw firsthand the suffering he was going through, listened firsthand to the stories of the relief that he was obtaining from not medicinal cannabis, but cannabis for medicinal purposes, acquired from illegal sources. Local police officers, including the local area commander, were totally supportive of the family in purchasing that, made no attempts to stop them, understood it, were aware of it, informed the commissioner, who is Andrew Scipione, of it, and they made no attempts to get in the way of it. So I thought that was quite a mature exercise of discretion in a real life situation. Mike Baird's experience, I think, fundamentally changed his mind, and he became a real advocate for change and for the implementation of medicinal cannabis laws. And in Queensland, I've had some recent dealings with senior police in Queensland. They have really have surprised me really with the positive attitude they have, not only to medicinal cannabis and drug driving laws, but also to illicit drugs more generally, and the need for change to the current tough on drugs criminalisation policy. So there are a range of attitudes. I think it's a terrible shame if that's the attitude Fiona, Victoria police have, because they've got to take the time to.
I think, can I just make a provision that, Mick, you're absolutely right, and I do not mean to lump all police into the same position, but when it was an assistant commissioner that we were working with, and I think, as we know, that police can be very risk averse in these areas.
Very much. Yeah.
And so it, in fact, she spoke about her father-in-law having, using medicinal cannabis and the benefits that he got from that. So she wasn't opposed per se to medicinal cannabis, but they couldn't get their heads across how they could allow medicinal cannabis patients to drive while not allowing adult use without a prescription cannabis users to not drive.
I think that those are certainly the problems. I mean, my own view, for what it's worth, is that we shouldn't be asking the police. I mean, we don't ask the judges. We don't ask a whole range of people. And I mean, police views, of course, should be taken into account, but they shouldn't be the be all and end all. And in effect, they have a veto. In any event, Tom, I think the next question is going to be for you and then Teresa, and that is probably the most popular question we've had tonight, which is about, are there better ways to test for impairment other than random drug tests? If the big bar to change is, well, how can we distinguish between detection at non-affected level and detection at affected level, then what's the research on this, Tom?
I mean, testing for impairments it's a difficult thing, and no one really has the answer to this at the moment, and a lot of countries are in a similar situation. I mean, most countries don't have random roadside drug testing, but they're dealing with increasing medical cannabis use and this issue of how do we measure that. So, in the States, for example, standardized field sobriety testing is still the dominant approach. So if you're weaving, you look like you're driving impaired, there's plumes of cannabis smoke trailing out of your car, you'll be pulled over. Police may make you, things like walking in a straight line, touching your finger to your nose, balance tests. These things they're all calibrated to alcohol, and they're actually very sensitive to alcohol intoxication. They're okay with cannabis. They're not perfect, but they're okay, and they're certainly, at least from my point of view, better than having a simple presence offense. So in most of those cases, if someone did fail one of those tests, then they would have to provide a blood sample. And in a lot of US states and in a lot of other countries as well, there are still per se laws in blood. So if you have more than a certain amount of THC present in your blood, then you can be charged with an offense. But I think no one really has the answer to this. To me, that's a better situation than what we have here. I think an alternative might be to have something like that and then use something like oral fluid testing as a tool for confirmation. So not simply just to see whether someone is positive or negative, but if there is evidence that someone is already impaired, then something like oral fluid testing might be a good way to go, well, what drug is that likely due to? And then that leads on to whether that's blood testing or whatever the process that police might normally follow. So I don't think anyone really has the answer to this. Some people are toying around with this idea of a cannabis breathalyzer at the moment. I know there's a couple of companies that are vying to get something out on the market. Whether that's really going to be any better than oral fluid testing, I'm not sure. I mean, the issue with oral fluid testing is that it's just detecting residual THC that's stuck in your mouth, essentially, from consuming cannabis. So whether breathalyzers are really any better, whether that's just detecting recent cannabis use that's being actually exhaled in your breath, we don't really know yet. So, I mean, the short answer to that is, the approach we have here is certainly not a very fair one, but I think no one really has a particularly good system for us to look to, in part because it's a very new problem, medical cannabis.
Thank you, Tom. Teresa, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, we basically not much. Tom said it all, but we know that the level of THC in the system doesn't necessarily correspond to the level of impairment. And among many patients, I've seen patients who are taking anything between 10 to 20 different medications, different opioids, benzodiazepines, and they commented they were much more impaired while taking cocktail of these heavy drugs. And their alertness and ability to drive better has actually improved while taking cannabis. So it's not an easy answer, but even just doing simple impairment tests, such as heel to toe or touch your nose and so on. And I know that that's what is happening in New Zealand, that you have the impairment test first before going to other tests. Plus, they are so-called fast and slow metabolizers. Everyone is different due to genetic variabilities in hepatic metabolic pathways. Some people will eliminate THC very quickly from their system, whereas for some, it will stay longer. Apart from that, as we all mentioned before, cannabis is fat-soluble, and for medicinal cannabis patient, it will probably be detectable all the time because they take the medication on a regular basis. And I'm probably a bit naive here, but we have so much technology. Why can't we have some kind of simple computer games that could be presented to a patient, just 2-3 minute test, some kind of technological feeling that they could score points whether or not they are impaired. So I'm sure that there would be better ways of addressing the problem that currently are.
Can I just add something there?
Yeah.
So there is this app, which many of you may have heard of, this Druid app, which has got quite a bit of hype about it at the moment as well. This has been developed by Michael Milburn in the States. And there's quite a bit of testing going on with this at the moment, and we're incorporating it into several of the trials that we're currently running. Part of the issue with this is how do you measure someone's performance relative to their baseline? If people just get a score when you test them, how do you know what score that person would normally have? So it's how we actually implement something like this, I think is actually quite complicated, but there's certainly, I suppose a reason to think that something like this, if you could give people a test that could be conducted in 2 or 3 minutes, which is as long as it takes to read an oral fluid drug test anyway, that would give you a measure of functional impairment, then obviously that would be a much better solution than what we currently have.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom.
We don't ask this question about benzodiazepines. We don't ask this question about opioids. We rely on the doctors and the patients, and we trust the patient who is on benzodiazepines or on opioids, that we say, you won't drive if you're not feeling up to it. And in fact, that's what it says on the packet. Don't drive if you're feeling impaired. And our doctors provide them with the risk assessments and all of those risk trees and risk analysis and all of that. But we don't, for every other prescription drug, we're not asking this question. And I frustrate because I think this question, we could be spending years and years and years trying to find this solution, and those years will be medicinal cannabis patients or patients not choosing cannabis because of these restrictions.
Yep. For myself, I think that an appropriate approach, particularly given Tom's research, would be to say that you're not to drive within 4 hours of taking your medication. That way, people could take their medication before they go to bed at night. They could then would be waiting way over 4 hours, and provided that you took your medication in accordance with your prescription and the directions of your doctor, then you'd have a defence to the offence, because that way no one's really worried about the test any longer. So in any event, I think we've covered some ground on that. It's a thorny problem, and I think we're really lucky that people like Tom are putting their mind to this and doing some good, solid, hard research. Of course, at the moment, we just have that total blanket approach. And Fiona's right, we don't have that for any other drugs. So, any other prescription drugs. There's some further questions, and I think that they're important. And I might open this one to Mick first. Mick, to what extent is this really about prohibition as opposed to having anything to do with road safety?
Well, I think it's underpinned by the fact of, prohibition and our obsession with the current tough on drugs policy, if you like. I think it is driven by road safety. I mean, we do have a bad road safety record in this country. We lose a lot of people on the roads in circumstances in which they shouldn't die. And there's a reason why people are very concerned about that. And so I understand that they'd want to be tough on any threat of, further impairment to our driving skills on the road. I think that's the basic thinking behind it. And I do think that's what drives police more than just the prohibition policy. But certainly, even at the police and certainly the government level, prohibition gets in our way all the time in terms of it trying to make any sort of inroads into the current state of play, no matter how many facts you're able to table and how much evidence you can provide of the fact that what we've now got is badly broken and isn't achieving any of the results that we set for ourselves, not achieving any of the outcomes that we really laid down. And is not minimising harm in any sense at all. And here's a classic example in terms of medicinal cannabis, where it's, of course, aggravating harms, as Fiona just said, in so many ways. I think it's driven by the fear and by the fear of being seen to, in any sense, going weak on a road death problem that is serious and a road toll problem that's a very serious one. Without people being prepared to dig even 1 inch below the surface to look at the sort of issues that certainly Tom and Teresa have talked about now, and the reality of what we all know, that, the taking of the drug, there is no sign of impairment in almost all of the apprehensions that occur. And there's simply the fact of the presence of a drug that is leading to the person securing a criminal conviction. To anybody who takes any time looking at that doesn't make much sense. But I think, as Tom said, I think until we can come up with a test that gives people some confidence, and I think it sounds like we're getting a long way down that track, which I think is very important, that we can assess, no matter whether I have a prescription or not, we can assess to some extent the reality of my impairment. Probably we're going to have some difficulty in changing the law at the moment. It's that what Fiona said about the police attitude. If they let them go and have a crash down the road, how am I going to feel? I mean, that tends to be how police officers think. And I can give you 1,000 reasons in terms of how many times we do that, and a crime takes place down the road and we don't stop exercising discretion. Of course, you can't be sure of the outcome of any discretion you exercise. And so the argument, in a sense, is really a silly one, but it's not, if you're not, at the same time, it's a concerned one. They are worried about that. That's driving their thinking. With a test like Tom has outlined and Teresa has touched on, I think that would give people a lot more comfort and confidence to move forward. At the moment, I think it's a case of it's illegal, therefore you can't do it. I mean, that's where prohibition, I think, is the underpinning problem here, David. This drug is an illegal drug, therefore you shouldn't have it in your system, so therefore you can't drive.
And of course we know that it's not an illegal drug in the sense that prescription works.
Yes.
The next question relates to modes of ingestion. Of course, I think there's smoking, vaping, eating, tablets. Is there a difference in terms of both detection and affectation? Tom?
Yes, there's a big difference in terms of detection. You only have THC in your oral fluid if you consume cannabis in such a way that it actually comes into contact with your mouth. If you vape it, if you smoke it, if you eat it as an edible, if you drop an oil under your tongue, all of those methods will lead to THC being present in your oral fluid or your saliva. If you ingest it as a capsule and there's no THC that actually physically touches your mouth, you won't have any THC in your oral fluid, very simply. You'll have it in your blood, but not in your oral fluid. So it doesn't transfer from blood into oral fluid. So whatever you have in your mouth is really just contamination from when you've actually consumed it. So yeah, there's a big difference. In terms of how it affects you, that's quite a complicated question, but THC, we talk about pharmacokinetics, which is really the movement of the drug through the body and how it's metabolized and eliminated. And there's big differences in the way you consume it. If you smoke cannabis or vaporize it, you get a very rapid peak in blood THC levels. So you get very high levels within a couple of minutes of smoking or vaping, any way that you inhale it. And then it begins to drop off very quickly after that. If you ingest it orally and it's absorbed through your gut, then it can take about an hour or two to reach the highest levels or maximum concentrations in your blood, and then it plateaus there for the next 3 or 4 hours or so and begins to drop off. The thing is, there's actually a huge difference in the maximum concentrations you might have depending on how you consume it. So, for example, if you consumed 2.5 milligrams of THC by vaping, and then you consume 50 milligrams of THC, so a far higher dose by ingesting it, you would probably still have a higher peak, so the highest level of blood THC after you'd smoked it or vaped it than if you had eaten it. So you get these, it's sort of difficult, I suppose, to put in a simple analogy, but the short is that, there's huge differences, and the amount of THC you have in your system varies enormously as a function of how you've consumed it, irrespective of how much THC is actually in your brain or how impaired you might actually be.
So why then aren't prescribers putting it into capsules rather than tincture or other forms? Would it not be better for drug driving purposes for people to be utilising capsules?
It would be better for drug driving purposes, but I'm not sure that's most physicians' aim, is to give people the medicine that's best for their drug driving purposes. Often it comes down to differences in bioavailability, absorption. For some people, for example, if you take vaping, the effects come on much more quickly. So for someone that really needs instant pain relief, that's going to generally be far more effective than swallowing a capsule. It's also much easier to titrate your dose. So you can have 1 or 2 inhalations, see how you're feeling, have another one if you need. If you swallowed a capsule, it might be 2 hours before you realized that dose of THC was actually a bit more than you intended to have. And obviously, if you're doing this over time under medical supervision, you figure that all out. But there's reasons why you might prefer to use an oil that you drop under your tongue or a vaporized product over a capsule.
Thanks for that. Teresa, did you want to add to that?
Yeah. I want to, as clinician, we prefer to start with the oil because it allows us very slow and gentle titration. So, because patients are very sensitive and there are quite a significant variabilities. Some people may require quite a bit of THC and some may be okay with very, very minute doses. So capsules tend to have the same dose. So it's a 20, 50 milligram or whatever it is. But when you have the oil, you can start very gently with the most minute dose and move it up to so-called sweet spot, where we have the most optimal therapeutic effect and no or minimal adverse effects. So once the dose is established, then I would be comfortable putting patients on capsule, but I really prefer oils. And for vaporization, we prefer to use this as to control breakthrough symptoms.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question, and I think this will at least start with Fiona, is Fiona, what can people best do to seek to change laws that they find so impairing on their lives?
I think Mick really showed the way there, and Lucy Haslam showed the way there, that it was those personal stories that affected change. And I know here in Victoria, it was the stories of young children with intractable epilepsy that swayed Daniel Andrews, our Premier, to make the move towards legalising medicinal cannabis and setting up a regime for medicinal cannabis. So it is those personal stories. And, every medicinal cannabis patient is a voter. And politicians, despite how they behave, actually like voters, or they want voters to like them. Sometimes they don't behave like that's what they're looking for. But it is those personal stories. It is the effects and the impacts that cannabis has on you. And I used a story of a young fellow who had epilepsy, and he wasn't able to drive because of his epilepsy. After a period of time on medicinal cannabis, he had no seizures for over 6 months. So this young man, for the first time in his life, was able to drive, was able to pursue, what he had hoped was he was able to go to college. But because of the prohibition on him driving, or the fear that he would get caught on a positive test. He was back at square one, even though he was now epilepsy free. So those personal stories to your local member do have an effect. They do have an effect, and you ask them to lobby for you. You ask them to advocate for you. And we all love sprinkling our speeches with the stories, the personal stories and analogies. And I think it's really important that people hear from you.
I think I really agree with you there. You know, what really moved me, I used to wish that on list days at Lismore Local Court that the politicians would just come in and see the personal story, because it was just absolutely tragic. I mean, people could see their whole lives falling apart. They were going to lose their jobs, their ability to take their kids to music lessons, their ability to do contact with their estranged family. Really, the lifestyle for people, particularly in rural and regional areas, without a licence can just be dreadful. And I was taking about 50 people a week's licence away from them. And every one of those was a personal story of tragedy. So, yes, I mean, I think that, and I do think the National Party has a big place to play here, because rural and regional people are doubly hit hard by this. I know that many people in the city still need their licence, but in the country, it's absolutely crucial. And people lose their jobs, they lose their houses.
I know it's a slight aside, but let's not forget that the overdose rate in Australia is double the road. Let's not forget that. Let's not forget that the people on opioids, the people on benzodiazepines are at risk of overdose. And we know, and I'm sure Teresa would know, and I'm sure many of the people on this call would know of people who've chosen to stick with those far more dangerous medicines because they are able to drive. And I think this is a great tragedy. And if we're trying to reduce the death toll, accidental death toll, then getting people off benzodiazepines, getting people off opioids would assist in that.
Well, that's right.
I want to add that data in Australia shows that out of all deaths due to overdose, 80% is caused by legally prescribed drugs, benzodiazepines, opioids. And we created a worldwide opioid epidemics. Whereas I don't believe we hear medicinal cannabis patient or any cannabis patients overdosing on cannabis. So this is quite a significant issue. Opioids, benzodiazepines are killing people. And here we have a better option, and we are limiting people at the same time. But just, to me, there's no compassion. It's really quite cruel.
I was speaking to a GP who prescribes here on the North Coast, and he was saying 50% of people come in, he assesses them, he prescribes, and then he tells them about the driving, and they never fill their prescription because they simply, they will go back to using their alcohol or their pain relief drugs rather than medicinal cannabis.
The treatment is not optimized because they are just sticking to CBD, and most of the time we only need a bit of THC and other components of the plant. So basically, patients, because of the law on driving, are not receiving the optimal treatment.
Yep, thank you. We're about to have CBD over the counter, and that will be able to have up to 1% THC. Tom, have there been any studies at all about whether that could be a detectable use?
We don't really know this yet. I think this is going to be a really interesting space to watch. We're not really sure. There's been some work with vaporized products. So in a lot of European countries, they're allowed to sell light cannabis, which I think is allowed to have up to 0.2% THC. And there's cases where people have well over the detection limit for THC here in their saliva after vaping those products. Now, of course, here we're talking about oils. I have seen some evidence that using CBD products with very small amounts of THC can produce certainly detectable concentrations of THC in blood and in saliva. Whether that will be enough to trigger false positives on roadside drug tests, not sure. But that's a very interesting question and something that we're trying to look into in some of our future research at Swinburne.
Okay. Sorry, I meant to go back to you, Mick, and ask you about what you thought people could do most, what's the most important thing people can do to try and get change.
Well, I think Fiona's right. I think it's got to be a combination, I think, of finding every mechanism we can, looking for every mechanism we can to give people a better understanding of the reality of the facts, but combining facts with scenarios or anecdotal evidence. I mean, it's very true to say, I think, that, facts tell and stories sell. And unless we find ways to personalise, and in all my experience in any of these issues of conflict, going back to the gun laws in John Howard's day, when we started, to get tough on guns and so on, it was only with the telling of the stories of what sort of the damage that was being caused by our current laws and why they needed to be changed and why people didn't need to have the guns they believed they needed to have, that you could start to sway people who otherwise thought the whole idea of change was stupid. And I think the reality is, and this is a very good example, because of course when you're talking to people with children, as so many of these cases are, with these crippling diseases that we know medicinal cannabis can be so helpful for, and the various forms of dreadful epilepsy, it tugs at every person's heartstrings. So I mean, we've got powerful information there, powerful stories to tell there. I don't think we can win just on the stories. I think it's got to be a combination of the facts, where Thomas is coming from, and Teresa, and those stories, but a combination that really puts meat on the bone and that personalises it for people. I remember being at a Rotary Club just recently, not long ago, and we're telling stories about homeless children, disadvantaged children who were just not only homeless, but basically defenceless and in a hopeless situation. And in the main were obviously on drugs and were sniffing petrol and the like, and drugs and other components and so on from spray cans. And it was only when somebody in the audience came up with a story about his own son's son, his grandson, that the whole room changed. Everybody knew him, they respected him, they liked him. And he told this story. He said, Mick's right. He said, look, I can tell you about young Johnny. Then he told this terrible story about what had happened to Johnny. This one story did what 40 minutes of talking from me hadn't looked like doing. And I mean, it is the reality. And I think we just need to feed off that, as what you say, what Fiona said about, politicians like voters. And the reason why they're so defensive about this is really because they believe most people don't want to see change. But if we can create an environment where it's clear that 51% of the people think change isn't a bad idea, and all of the surveys that are being conducted show those figures are going up all the time. And in some cases, I just see in regard to decriminalisation, for example, in some of the electorates in New South Wales, their figures are up at 80 and 90% in support of change. Well, that was unheard of a few years ago. You would never have got that in any electorate. So I think that's an important part of the equation. But so we need to continue to get the message out in the way we are now. We need other people to do that as well. And we need to tell those stories that show the facts support the reality that what we've got doesn't work and isn't necessary and isn't dealing with impairment or increasing the danger on the roads, and the stories that will tell people why this is so damn important, that the penalty far outweighs the crime. What you were saying, David, about your experience, and like the punishment, it just has no relationship to the crime these people have committed. It far outweighs it.
I think that's a really good point. People have been asking on the chat line and in the questions before, what are the penalties? And of course, they vary from state to state, but essentially, and probably the worst is Victoria, where there is no discretion for the court for someone to keep their licence, even if it's a first offence, even if it's medicinal, even if they've got a prescription, even if they desperately need their licence for work. So Victoria has perhaps the most narrow laws. So Tom, you're in the right place. And of course, Fiona, so are you. But in New South Wales, at least, my experience now representing people charged with these offences is that the magistrates just roll their eyes when people come in with a prescription. And indeed, recently, I had a magistrate directly speak to the prosecutor in open court and say, well, why are you prosecuting these matters where someone has a prescription and there's no affectation and there's no accident or collision? And of course, that's the right question. And we are trying to approach the DPP to simply not prosecute these matters. But yeah, it's slow going. Now, people have asked, oh, there's more, so many questions. There's at least 100 questions. I do want to say, what should you do? The other question that's been asked very much just on the legal side is, what should you do if you get dealt with for drink driving? And the short answer is that you do need to get legal advice. There is no legal service set up for this. You're not going to get legal aid for it. And the reason for that is because it doesn't lead to jail. But obviously there's huge consequences for people, and they desperately need legal advice. Community legal centres can provide first instance advice. The NIMB and Hemp Embassy does as well. But we at Drive Change get completely overwhelmed with questions, and we generally refer people as best we can to lawyers in their local area. And representing yourself, of course, is also an option if it comes to that. Is there any other comments? We've got about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to wrap up by giving each of the panelists just an opportunity to give some finishing off comments. Teresa?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. I've sort of wanted to voice the voice of a patient as a doctor and a clinician as well. And I'm really hoping for the change for the better, for the sake for all of us involved.
Thank you. I should say we are going to do a blog with the to answer any of the outstanding questions that we haven't got to. So if you go to the Drive Change blog website, over the next few days we'll work our way through the questions. Obviously, there's a lot. There's well over 300. So some of them will be doubles, I'm sure. I hope. Tom, finishing off comments.
I suppose I'd just like to say thank you for having me on here as well. And I'll probably also give a shameless plug for some of our research at the moment, because we do need participants. We currently have a detection study at the moment, which is looking at exactly how long after consuming medical cannabis you're likely to test positive with a roadside drug test for. I actually saw a comment pop up in the chat before where someone linked to the study, but I can send something out afterwards. And I'm also getting started a study next year, a big study which is going to run for a couple of years, where we're going to track new patients for 3 months as they start using medical cannabis. So we're actually trying to find people before they start treatment and then follow them and track them every month and see if we see any changes in driving, cognitive performance. This can be in chronic pain patients. So please do keep an eye out for the work we're doing at Swinburne. Yeah, thank you all very much for being involved. And, we've come a long way in 5 or 6 years since that first United in Compassion symposium at Tamworth. So I think that shows you that things do change for the better, and hopefully rationality will prevail at the end of the day.
Thank you, Mick.
Tom's quite right. We have come a long way, and I think we do need to remind ourselves about that. I mean, it is a journey of many steps, and it's going to be an incremental change process, I think, unless something dramatic happens in the scientific world to sort of give people a level of confidence they don't have. But I think we just need to persevere, to keep sending out the message in the way we're talking about today, that we really, don't lose our endeavour and our fervour for that, that we, try to build that evidence cachet that Thomas is talking about. But at the same time, we tell as many stories of the reality. And when I talked about penalties, David, I wasn't just as well thinking about the formal penalties, but the penalties like you talked about, the fellow who lost his business because he could no longer get insurance cover because of the conviction, or not even a conviction in some cases. And there's lots of those cases, can't travel to other countries and can't do this and can't do that. If you were going to join, I remember defending a couple of people in Queensland in my short time at the bar, one of whom had applied to be a teacher and was just waiting for final acceptance, having been told he had the job, and another one was applying for the Defence Force, both of whom would have failed had they been convicted of simple use and possession of cannabis. Just a party on a beach, in a beach hut, neighbours complained about the noise, police arrive, usual thing, bongs and cannabis seized, but the penalties were going to far outweigh the crime had they been convicted. Luckily, they avoided conviction, but and that's the reality here. And I think we need to get those messages across. The more people, and we need to start aiming at the unconverted. No use patting ourselves on the back and talking to people like I guess most of the audience here tonight are people who believe in what we're saying and where we want to go. And that's great. But we need to get this message to people who think it's a lot of nonsense. Because the more they listen to what we have to say, the less of them, I think, will think it's a lot of nonsense.
Thank you. Fiona.
Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone. And it's been great to be part of this panel. And, I do agree that we have actually come a long way. And I think, looking one of the latest household drug surveys, 70 to 80% of Australians, I think was the number, are very supportive of the availability of medicinal cannabis in Australia. Now, if you imagine back to when, many of the warriors who are watching today started this campaign, there was nothing like that, the support. So we've won, we will win this war, but we need to keep telling those stories. We need to keep educating people. I love that line that facts tell, and stories sell. I think that's just terrific. And so you've got Tom here, providing us with the facts. On a little note, just thinking about Victoria, there's been a push to actually even further strengthen the drug driving laws down here. And there is a further push to make them even harsher, and even if they could be any more rigid. And in some ways, maybe that's the opportunity that's where we get to carve out medicinal cannabis as part of that. Not that I actually want to see our drug driving laws become more rigid, because they affect so many people and as they say, the time doesn't fit the crime. But again, thanks everyone, and thanks for all the work of so many of you over the many years.
Yeah, thanks to our panelists. I've been told to say that we are going to be introducing through Drive Change a letter writing campaign, and which we'll be launching shortly through Drive Change, and that's a start. And I would also comment that there is hope. When I first started practicing law, I represented people charged with homosexuality, with blasphemy, with prostitution, and of course in
my wheelhouse.
Of course, I didn't represent you, but and of course, in all states but New South Wales now, it's actually legal to kill yourself. So not while you're having a joint though. But so the point is that there is change, and we will win this. We will win this battle, and I think we will win it by those stories and really taking it on. If every one of those 100,000 medicinal prescription patients wrote to their local members and to their local papers, or CC'd their local papers in, I think, and posted it on Facebook, I really think we would see change far more rapidly. But I do want to acknowledge all the people who've participated. There's so many questions, and that's wonderful, and engaged. And I know that out there are a lot of people suffering. They're suffering because they can't use the medicine of their choice. They're suffering because they're driving in fear. They're suffering because they're frightened for their families and their livelihoods. And they're frightened because they're every day facing a choice of, will I use the medicine that makes me feel good or better, and will I risk my insurance? Will I risk all of this? So I do want to acknowledge that, and I would like to very much thank the panelists, each of you, Mick, Teresa, Tom, Fiona. Thank you so much, and to B, who's behind the scenes, and Tom, the other Tom, for organising this. So do go to drivechange.com and have a look. We are a little over time, but I really would like to thank everybody for their participation, and look out for the answers to the questions on the blog. From very rainy Coffs Harbour, it's good night from me.